Thomas could feel the heat rising off the asphalt as he pushed his legs to keep moving. The sun was harsh, beating down on his back as if trying to remind him of his age with every heavy step. His breath came in shallow bursts, but his determination burned strong. He was 70 years old and had seen more finish lines than he could count. But today was different. The marathon used to be his domain, his sanctuary, where his body obeyed him with precision, and every stride was a mark of victory. But now, as he ran among the younger, faster runners, he felt like a relic, a reminder of time's relentless march. His knees throbbed, and each breath felt like it was pulled from a deep well. The crowd along the street cheered for the runners passing by, but Thomas wasn't their focus. They were looking at the leaders, the youth whose muscles rippled with energy and speed. His pace slowed as the voices around him blurred, becoming white noise against the pounding in his ears. Just a little farther, he thought. You can still do this. But then it happened. Thomas's foot caught the edge of a raised crack in the pavement, and before he could catch himself, his body tumbled forward. The world spun in slow motion as he hit the ground hard, his palms scraping against the rough surface, his knees slamming into the street with a sharp jolt of pain. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, but no one rushed to help. They watched him, some with pity, others with impatience, waiting for the race to continue. Is he okay? A voice whispered from the crowd. He's too old to be doing this. Another one muttered. Thomas gritted his teeth and tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled beneath him. His body, once strong and agile, now felt like it belonged to someone else. He looked around, eyes blurry from the fall and the humiliation. The other runners rushed past him without a glance, their footsteps echoing in his ears like a reminder of everything he used to be. A young volunteer jogged over, kneeling beside him. "Sir, are you all right?" There was concern in his voice, but something about the way he said "sir" stung more than the physical pain. "Maybe it's time to call it a day?" Thomas shook his head, swallowing the lump of pride in his throat. "I'm fine," he muttered, forcing himself to stand. The crowd's whispers grew louder, and he felt their eyes on him, judging, questioning his place among these runners. "Just let it go, old man," someone from the sideline said under their breath, loud enough for Thomas to hear. The words hit harder than the fall itself. He straightened his back, ignoring the sharp pain in his knees and the ache in his pride. His hands shook as he dusted off his scraped palms. He wasn't going to quit, not here, not like this. But as he hobbled forward, well behind the pack, the reality sank in. This wasn't the race he had imagined. By the time he crossed the finish line, long after the crowd had thinned and the younger runners had celebrated their victories, Thomas felt more alone than ever. His body ached, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the whispers that still clung to him. His eyes scanned the faces, but no one was watching him anymore. He had become invisible. Medals had already been handed out. The race officials were packing up, and only a few spectators remained. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow, his chest rising and falling with the effort it took to simply stand there. He had finished, but for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a victory. With a sigh, he began the long walk home, each step a reminder that time was no longer on his side. The walk home felt longer than usual. Thomas's body ached with every step, but it wasn't just a physical pain. The sting of embarrassment was far worse. Each echo of a passing car seemed to replay the voices from the race, their words digging into him like tiny barbs. Too old. Why is he even doing this? He pushed open the door to his modest home and was greeted by the quiet hum of the place. It had been years since his house had seen much activity. His wife had passed on nearly a decade ago, and his daughter, Sarah, now visited sporadically, always busy with her own family and work. The stillness used to comfort him, but today it felt oppressive. Thomas limped to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, the cold liquid soothing his dry throat, but doing nothing to ease the discomfort twisting in his chest. His gaze wandered to the small trophy case that sat in the corner of the living room, a reminder of a different time. Inside were his medals, his photographs, the memories of who he once was. He walked over, his eyes falling on a picture of himself crossing the finish line of his first marathon. He looked so much younger then, strong, proud. The photo next to it showed him on the podium, gold medal around his neck, his smile wide and full of life. He let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the shelf for balance. What happened to that man? He wondered. Where had the years gone? He still felt like the same person inside, but his body was betraying him at every turn. Today's race had only solidified what he'd been avoiding for so long. He was no longer the man in those pictures. As Thomas stood there, lost in thought, the front door creaked open. "Dad!" It was Sarah. Her voice was soft, filled with concern. She stepped into the living room, her eyes immediately scanning him up and down. The bruises on his knees, the scratches on his hands, and the defeated look on his face told her everything she needed to know. "Oh, Dad," she sighed, walking over to him. "I heard about what happened." Thomas frowned but didn't say anything. He hated that she had to see him like this, broken, defeated. He could feel her eyes on him, filled with worry, and it only deepened the hollow feeling inside. "You can't keep doing this," she said gently, though her words had an edge of finality. "You're not young anymore, and it's not safe. You're pushing yourself too hard." "I'm fine," he replied, more defensively than he intended. He knew she meant well, but the last thing he needed was someone telling him to stop, especially now. Sarah shook her head, her brow furrowed. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. You've already had your time in the spotlight. It's okay to let go." But that was the problem. Letting go. Thomas didn't know how. He'd spent so many years of his life running. Not just on the track, but from the idea that one day it would all stop. That one day, he wouldn't be able to lace up his shoes, wouldn't feel the wind against his face or the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The thought of it terrified him. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I'm not ready to give it up," he muttered, barely meeting her gaze. Sarah sighed and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard. I do. But you're going to hurt yourself, Dad. And I don't want to see you go through that." The words lingered in the air, thick with emotion. Thomas looked away, his eyes landing once more on the old photos. How do you just stop? He wondered. Running had been everything to him. It was the one constant in his life, the thing that had given him purpose, drive, identity. Without it, what was left? "I just need time," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Sarah didn't push him further. She knew better. Instead, she gave him a sad smile and gently kissed his cheek before heading toward the door. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" she said, her voice softer now. "Just take care of yourself." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Thomas alone again with his thoughts. He sat down heavily on the couch, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He stared at his hands that had once gripped the tape of the finish line, raised in victory, now trembling slightly as they rested in his lap. Was it really time to stop? To let go of the one thing that had ever truly made him feel alive? As the silence of the house enveloped him once more, a wave of doubt washed over Thomas. He had never felt so lost, so disconnected from himself. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to hang up his running shoes for good. But the very thought made his chest tighten, as if a piece of him would be lost forever. And yet, the world didn't seem to care. The races would go on without him. The younger runners would keep pushing forward, and no one would remember the man who once stood at the top. Time had moved on, and maybe it was time for him to do the same. Or maybe there was still something left. One more race. One more chance to prove that he hadn't been completely erased by the years. Days passed, but the weight of the race still clung to Thomas like a shadow. Every morning, he'd lace up his shoes, thinking he'd go for a short jog to clear his mind, but each time he opened the door, something held him back. His body, sore and bruised from the fall, was a constant reminder of his limits. He was stuck in a loop of doubt, unsure if he could ever run again without feeling that sting of humiliation. It was on one of these quiet, restless mornings when the mail arrived. Thomas shuffled to the door, his joints stiff from inactivity. He didn't expect much. Maybe a bill or some advertisement for a service he didn't need. But when he saw the thick envelope addressed to him in familiar handwriting, his heart skipped a beat. Jack Davis. He hadn't spoken to Jack in years. They had once been fierce competitors on the track, always pushing each other to run faster, harder. Back then, Jack had been more than just a rival. He'd been a friend. But life, as it often does, pulled them in different directions, and they had lost touch. Thomas hesitated, staring at the envelope in his hand. What could Jack possibly want after all this time? With a sigh, he tore it open and unfolded the letter. Thomas, it's been too long, old friend. I've heard you're still out there, hitting the pavement, even after all these years. Good to know some of us haven't slowed down completely. I'm writing because I'm putting together something special. A reunion of sorts for us old-timers who haven't let age keep us off the track. It's a marathon, but not just any race. It's for us, for the veterans. Those of us who've seen our share of wins and losses, who know the real meaning of pushing through the pain. I'm inviting you to run with me, Thomas. One more race. Let's show these younger guys what we're still made of. It won't be like the old days, but it'll be something worth remembering. What do you say, Jack? Thomas let the letter fall into his lap as he sat down heavily on the couch. His first instinct was to laugh. A marathon for veterans? For men their age? It sounded absurd. He could barely finish a neighborhood run without collapsing, and Jack wanted him to run a full marathon again. But as the idea settled in his mind, something shifted. The old fire, buried under layers of self-doubt and frustration, flickered faintly. He hadn't spoken to Jack in years, but the invitation felt like a lifeline, a way back to the man he used to be, or at least a chance to prove he still had something left. But the doubts came rushing in just as quickly. He remembered the fall, the stares, the whispered comments. What if that happened again, but worse? What if he couldn't finish? The idea of failing in front of an old rival and friend gnawed at him. Later that evening, as Thomas sat by the window, the letter still in his hand, Sarah called. Her voice, as always, was filled with concern. "How are you feeling, Dad? Are you doing okay?" He hesitated, his eyes drifting to the letter. "I got a letter today." "Oh, from who?" "Jack Davis." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sarah had heard of Jack, of course. Growing up, she had listened to endless stories of their races, their victories, their near ties. She knew how much that friendship and rivalry had meant to her father. "Jack," she finally said. "What did he want?" Thomas swallowed, unsure of how to explain it without sounding foolish. "He's organizing a marathon for old-timers like us." "Are you serious?" Her voice was tinged with disbelief, and Thomas couldn't blame her. "And he wants you to run?" "Yeah," Thomas replied quietly. "One more race." There was a long silence on the line, and Thomas could almost feel Sarah biting back her thoughts. He knew she was worried. After what had happened at the last race, she probably thought the idea of him running again was ridiculous. "Dad, I don't know if—" "I know what you're going to say," he cut her off, his voice sharper than he intended. "And maybe you're right, but I don't know, Sarah. This feels different. It's not about winning or proving anything. It's about finishing. For me." Another pause, this time softer. "Are you sure?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "No, I'm not. But if I don't try, I'll never know if I still have it in me." He heard her sigh on the other end. "Just promise me you'll be careful. And don't push yourself too hard." "I'll be careful," he promised, though he wasn't sure what careful really meant in this situation. He wasn't going to half-run this. If he was in, he was all in. After hanging up, Thomas sat in the quiet house, the letter from Jack resting on the table in front of him. The idea still seemed crazy. A marathon at his age, after everything? But Jack had always known how to light a fire in him, and right now, It was the only thing keeping the darkness of doubt at bay. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas picked up a pen and wrote his response. "Jack, you're on." The next morning, Thomas stood in front of his bedroom mirror, staring at his reflection. The bags under his eyes had deepened over the years, and the lines on his face told a story of time's relentless march. But beneath the weathered exterior, he could still see a glimmer of the man he used to be. Today was a day. He'd told Jack he would do it. Now, he had no choice but to follow through. Thomas rummaged through his closet, pulling out his old running shoes. They were worn but familiar, like old friends waiting patiently for his return. He laced them up slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as he tied the knot. He hadn't done this in a while, and the thought of starting again after so long made his heart race in anticipation and fear. When he stepped outside, the air was crisp, a sharp contrast to the heat of his last race. His neighborhood was quiet, with only a few early risers walking their dogs or heading to work. He stretched briefly, his muscles tight and uncooperative, before setting off down the street at a slow, cautious pace. The first few steps felt awkward. His legs were stiff, and his knees ached almost immediately. His body protested, reminding him that it wasn't as young or as strong as it once was. But Thomas pushed through the discomfort, forcing himself to keep going. One foot in front of the other, he thought. Just keep moving. As he jogged past familiar houses and empty sidewalks, memories of his youth flooded back. He remembered running these same streets as a much younger man, his body full of energy, his pace quick and light. Back then, running had been easy, natural. But now, every step felt like a battle. He hadn't been running for more than 10 minutes when the fatigue hit him hard. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs felt like lead. Sweat trickled down his forehead, stinging his eyes. He slowed to a walk, his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, louder than the sound of his feet hitting the pavement. "This is going to be harder than I thought," he admitted to himself. The reality of it all settled in. He wasn't the same man who could run for miles without breaking a sweat. He was older, slower, and more fragile. The thought of running a full marathon again seemed impossible. Doubt crept in, whispering that he was setting himself up for failure. As he stood there, catching his breath and feeling the familiar tug of discouragement, a car pulled up alongside him. The window rolled down and Sarah's face appeared, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Dad, what are you doing?" Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to downplay how winded he was. "Just getting back into it," he said between breaths. Sarah frowned, stepping out of the car. "Are you sure this is a good idea? You don't look so good." "I'm fine," he insisted, though he knew she could see through him. "I just need to build back up, that's all." Sarah crossed her arms, clearly unconvinced. "Dad, you don't have to do this. You've already proven yourself. You don't need to push yourself so hard." Thomas shook his head. "This isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about finishing something. I need to know if I can still do it." She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "If this is what you really want, I'll help you, but you've got to take it slow. Promise me that." He nodded, grateful for her support, even if she didn't fully understand why this was so important to him. Over the next few weeks, Thomas began a routine. Each morning, he'd push himself a little further, a little harder. The first days were brutal. His muscles screamed in protest, and the ache in his joints seemed to intensify with each passing mile. But he kept going. Every time he thought about quitting, he remembered Jack's letter. He wasn't just running for himself. He was running to prove that age hadn't erased everything he'd worked for. Some mornings, Sarah would join him, jogging slowly by his side, making sure he didn't overdo it. Their runs were mostly quiet, but there was a comfort in having her there, even if he didn't always admit it. It reminded him of the days when she was younger, when she'd watch his races from the sidelines, cheering him on with wide eyes and a proud smile. One morning, after a particularly grueling run, Sarah finally spoke up. "Why is this so important to you?" she asked, her breath coming in quick gasps as they slowed to a walk. Thomas thought for a moment before answering. Because running, it's always been who I am. It's how I've measured my life. Without it, I don't know who I'd be. Sarah didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced over at him, her expression softening. But you don't need to run to be important, Dad. You're more than just a runner. Thomas nodded, appreciating her words, but inside he wasn't so sure. Running had defined him for so long. It was a thing that gave his life purpose and direction. And now, facing the reality of his own limitations, he was scared of what life would be without it. As the weeks passed, Thomas's body began to adapt, slowly but surely. The runs became less painful, and though he wasn't as fast or as strong as he once was, he could feel the old rhythm returning. His heart pounded, his breath came more evenly, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like a runner again. But the marathon was looming, and the question still lingered. Could he finish? Could he truly do this one more time? Thomas stood at the edge of the track, hands on his hips, staring at the familiar oval shape, the worn rubber surface. The white lanes curving around the bends brought back memories of races long past. It had been years since he had trained on a proper track like this. Most of his running now was done on the streets or in parks. The track had been reserved for his youth, for the days when speed was everything. As he began his warm-up, the familiar surroundings triggered a flood of memories. The sound of feet pounding against the ground, the sharp scent of sweat in the air, the tension before a race. All of it came rushing back. He could almost hear the cheers of the crowd, the low murmur of excitement that grew louder as the race began. He could see his younger self, strong and determined, standing at the starting line, focused solely on the finish ahead. Thomas had always been driven, almost to the point of obsession. Back then, winning wasn't just a goal. It was the only thing that mattered. He closed his eyes and remembered one race in particular, the national championship. It had been the defining moment of his career. The stands were packed, the air electric with anticipation. He was up against Jack Davis, his fiercest rival. They had trained together, pushed each other to the limits, but on race day, there were no friends, only competitors. The gun had fired, and Thomas had exploded off the line, his legs pumping with the strength and precision of countless hours of training. He and Jack had stayed neck and neck for most of the race, neither willing to give an inch. The crowd roared as they entered the final stretch. But something had gone wrong. In the last 100 meters, Thomas had felt a sharp pain shoot through his calf, a muscle cramp, sudden and debilitating. Jack had surged ahead, crossing the finish line just seconds before Thomas, who stumbled in agony just short of his goal. He had collapsed to the ground, defeated, the pain in his leg nothing compared to the anguish of losing the race that had meant everything to him. That race had haunted him for years. Even now, standing on the track decades later, he could feel the sting of that loss, the bitterness of knowing he had come so close, only to have victory slip through his fingers. But what lingered more than the loss was what had come after. Jack had won fair and square, but he had been the first to rush to Thomas's side when he collapsed, helping him up, patting him on the back. In that moment, Thomas had felt both the crushing weight of defeat and the warmth of true friendship. Jack hadn't gloated, hadn't rubbed the victory in his face. He had just smiled and said, "You'll get me next time." Only there hadn't been a next time. Life had pulled them apart after that race, their competitive days behind them. Thomas had gone on to win other races, but none had meant as much as that one. The race where Jack had beaten him, and where he had learned that winning wasn't the only thing that defined him. Now, as he stood on the track, those memories felt like ghosts, both painful and comforting. He realized how much he had allowed his past to shape his present. All these years, he had been chasing the idea of what he used to be, as if his worth were measured only by his victories. But maybe there was more to it than that. As he jogged around the track, his mind wandered through the years. The wins, the losses, the sacrifices. He had given so much of himself to running, to the pursuit of excellence. But in the process, he had missed things too. moments with his family, with Sarah, who had watched him from the sidelines, cheering him on, even when he was too focused on the finish line to see her. The thought made him slow down, his feet dragging slightly on the rubber surface. What had he really been running for all this time? Was it the medals? The trophies? Or was it something deeper? A way to escape the fear of aging? The fear of becoming irrelevant? He stopped in the middle of the track, hands resting on his knees, and took a deep breath. The air felt heavy, like the weight of everything he had been carrying for so long. The man he had been in his youth, fast, unstoppable, driven by competition, was still inside him, but now there was more. He wasn't just a runner anymore. He was a father, a friend, a man who had lived a full life. Maybe that was enough. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a sense of peace. The past would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define his future. He could still run, still push himself, but he didn't need to win. He just needed to finish. That night, after another exhausting day of training, he sat with Sarah at the kitchen table, a simple dinner between them. She watched him carefully, noticing the shift in his demeanor. "You're thinking about something," she said, her voice soft but curious. Thomas smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Just remembering the old days." "Good memories?" He nodded. "Some, but also realizing I spent a lot of time chasing things that don't matter as much as I thought." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to run to prove anything, Dad. Not to me, not to anyone." Thomas reached out and placed his hand on hers. "I know, but this race, it's not about proving anything. It's about finishing what I started." And for the first time, he truly believed that. The morning of the marathon arrived with a chill in the air, the kind that seeped into your bones and made everything feel sharper, more alive. Thomas stood at the starting line, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. Around him were other runners, some in their 60s and 70s, others in their 50s. There was a quiet camaraderie between them, a shared understanding of what it had taken for each of them to be here. Thomas adjusted the bib number pinned to his shirt and stretched, feeling the familiar tightness in his calves. He wasn't as nervous as he had expected to be. Sure, there was an edge of anxiety, but it was tempered by something stronger: determination. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. This was for him. Jack stood a few feet away, looking every bit the man Thomas remembered. He was older now, of course, his hair thinner and his frame slightly more hunched, but the fire in his eyes was the same. When Jack caught sight of him, he grinned and walked over, clapping Thomas on the back. "Didn't think you'd show up," Jack said, his grin widening. "But I'm glad you did." Thomas chuckled. "Wouldn't miss it. Not after that letter." Jack nodded, and for a moment, the two stood in silence, watching as the other runners gathered at the line. There was no need for words. The race they were about to run wasn't just about distance. It was about everything they had been through to get here. As the official gave the signal for the race to begin, Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. The familiar rush of adrenaline kicked in, and he was moving before he had a chance to second-guess himself. His legs found their rhythm, slow but steady, as he fell into the pace he had practiced over the past weeks. Jack ran beside him, their strides sinking almost naturally. The first few miles passed in a blur of focus. Thomas kept his eyes ahead, one foot in front of the other, just as he had done so many times before. His body felt good, not perfect, but strong enough to keep going. The crowd that lined the streets was smaller than he remembered from his younger days, but the cheers were there, the encouragement that had always pushed him forward. At mile 6, the fatigue began to settle in. His breath came a little harder, his legs a little heavier, but Thomas kept going, even as Jack slowly pulled ahead of him. He didn't mind. This wasn't about beating Jack. This was about finishing. As the miles ticked by, the race became less about the people around him and more about the battle within. His muscles screamed in protest, his joints ached, and there were moments when he questioned whether he could keep going. But every time the thought of stopping crossed his mind, he remembered why he was here. It wasn't about winning. It was about proving to himself that he could still do it, that the runner inside him hadn't disappeared with age. By mile 15, his pace had slowed significantly, and the pain in his knees had become a constant throb. The other runners, many of them younger, began to pass him, some offering sympathetic glances, others simply focused on their own race. But Thomas wasn't discouraged. He had expected this. The marathon wasn't about speed. It was about endurance. It was about finishing, no matter how long it took. He thought of Sarah, waiting for him at the finish line. She had promised to be there, cheering him on, just like she used to when she was a little girl. The memory of her small voice shouting, "Go, Dad, you can do it," gave him strength. She was older now, of course, with her own life, but she still believed in him, and that belief was enough to keep him moving. At mile 20, the real struggle began. His legs felt like they were made of concrete, and every step sent a jolt of pain through his body. His vision blurred slightly, and his breath came in short, labored bursts. He slowed to a walk, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind screaming at him to stop. But he didn't stop. Not yet. Ahead of him, he saw Jack, who had also slowed to a walk. The two men caught each other's eyes, and Jack gave him a nod. They were both feeling it now. The weight of their years, the toll of the race. But they were still here, still moving forward. When Thomas finally reached the last mile, he wasn't sure how he was still standing. His body had long since given up on him, but his mind, his heart, kept him going. The finish line was just ahead, a blur of banners and cheering spectators. He forced his legs into a slow jog, his teeth clenched against the pain. The crowd's cheers grew louder as he approached, but all he could focus on was the finish line. It seemed so far away, like it was taunting him, daring him to give up. But then, through the crowd, he saw Sarah. She was standing at the edge of the track, her hands cupped around her mouth as she shouted his name. Her face was filled with pride, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Go, Dad! You can do it!" The sound of her voice gave him the final push he needed. With a surge of energy he didn't know he had left, Thomas picked up his pace, his feet pounding against the ground as he closed the distance. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he didn't care. He wasn't going to stop now. When he crossed the finish line, it wasn't with the speed or grace he once had. His legs nearly gave out beneath him, and his chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. But he had done it. He had finished. The applause around him felt distant, like it was coming from another world. But all he could focus on was Sarah, running toward him, her face full of joy. She threw her arms around him, her embrace warm and tight. "You did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Thomas leaned into her, his body exhausted but his heart full. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He hadn't won, but he had finished, and that was all that mattered. The moment after crossing the finish line felt like a blur to Thomas. He leaned heavily against Sarah, his legs trembling under the strain of the race. Every inch of his body ached, his muscles protesting each small movement, but none of it seemed to matter. He had finished. Sarah stepped back slightly, her hands still on his shoulders, a proud smile lighting up her face. "You did it, Dad. I knew you could." Thomas managed a weak smile, wiping the sweat from his brow. He couldn't quite believe it himself. In those final miles, there had been moments when he doubted, when his body had screamed at him to stop. But something deep inside had kept him going. The years of training, the countless races, and the stubbornness that had defined him for most of his life. He glanced around at the other runners, many of whom had already crossed the line and were now basking in their own small victories. Jack was there too, sitting on the curb with a bottle of water in his hand, catching his breath. When their eyes met, Jack raised the bottle in a silent salute. Thomas gave a nod in return, feeling a swell of something that wasn't quite pride, but more like gratitude. He wasn't sure he would have made it through the race without Jack's letter, without the challenge that had reignited the fire in him. A race official came over, offering Thomas a medal. Nothing grand, just a simple acknowledgement that he had finished. Thomas took it, feeling the cool metal in his hand, and slipped it around his neck. It wasn't about the medal, but holding it reminded him of all the medals and trophies that had come before, of a life spent pushing his limits. He turned to Sarah, who was watching him with quiet admiration. She hadn't been there for every race, hadn't seen him in his prime, but she had always been his biggest supporter. And now, seeing the pride in her eyes, he realized that this race wasn't just about proving something to himself. It was about showing her that he was still strong, that he still had the spirit of the man she'd looked up to her whole life. "Let's sit down," Sarah said softly, guiding him over to a bench near the finish line. As they sat, the cool breeze sweeping over them, Thomas closed his eyes and let the fatigue wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about what came next or about the races he had lost or won. He was simply in the moment, content with what he had accomplished. "You didn't have to do this for me, you know," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I've always been proud of you, Dad, whether you were running or not." Thomas smiled at her words, but he knew that this race had been for more than just her approval. It had been about finding himself again, about reconnecting with the part of him that had always been a runner, no matter how much time had passed. "I know," he said quietly, "but this was something I needed to do. For me." Sarah nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "You're still the toughest guy I know." Thomas chuckled, the sound deep and rumbling in his chest. Tough. He wasn't sure if that was the right word anymore, but he appreciated the sentiment. He'd fought through something today. Not just the physical pain, but the doubts and fears that had plagued him for so long. And in that fight, he had found a part of himself that he thought he'd lost. As they sat there, watching the last of the runners cross the finish line, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The race hadn't been about glory or proving anything to anyone else. It had been about finishing what he started, about proving to himself that he still had the strength, both in body and in spirit, to endure. Jack eventually made his way over, still looking winded but with a wide grin on his face. "Hell of a race, huh?" he said, clapping Thomas on the back. Thomas smiled, his body too tired to do much else. "Hell of a race," he agreed. Jack sat down beside him, the two men sharing a quiet moment of victory. There was no need for words. The bond between them, forged through years of competition and camaraderie, said everything that needed to be said. After a while, Jack stood up and stretched, groaning as his muscles protested. "Well, I'd say we've earned ourselves a good meal. What do you think?" Thomas nodded, the idea of food appealing now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Sounds like a plan." As they walked away from the finish line, with Sarah at his side and Jack cracking jokes about their old racing days, Thomas felt lighter than he had in years. He wasn't the same man he had been in his youth, but that was okay. The marathon had shown him that he didn't need to be. He was still Thomas, still a runner, still capable of achieving things that mattered, even if they weren't measured in medals or times. For the first time, he realized that finishing the race wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he didn't need to chase victory or outrun time. He had finished, and that was enough. Later that evening, after the race had ended and the crowds had dispersed, Thomas sat on the front porch of his house. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet street. The world around him was peaceful, a stark contrast to the intensity of the day. His body still ached from the marathon, and the stiffness in his knees reminded him of the effort it had taken just to finish. But there was something deeper than the physical exhaustion that kept him rooted in place, watching as the day turned into night. It was a feeling of contentment, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Sarah had left not long ago, hugging him tightly before heading back to her own family. Her words lingered in his mind. "I've always been proud of you." He knew she meant it. And for the first time, Thomas realized he was proud of himself too, not for the races he had won, or the medals that lined his shelves, but for the strength it had taken to keep going, even when everything seemed to be slipping away. As he sat there, Reflecting on the years behind him, Thomas realized that his life had been shaped by more than just the miles he had run or the competitions he had entered. The real victory had been in the perseverance, in the willingness to push forward despite the inevitable losses that come with age. It wasn't about winning every race. It was about finishing the ones that mattered most. In the stillness of the evening, his thoughts drifted back to the early days, the excitement of his first race, the rush of crossing that first finish line. He remembered how, back then, it had been about proving something, to himself, to others. But somewhere along the way, the race had changed. It had become less about winning and more about endurance, about finding out how much he could give and still keep going. He smiled to himself, thinking about Jack. That old rivalry had once fueled him, had pushed him to be better, faster. But now, it felt different. It wasn't about beating Jack or anyone else. It was about the shared experience, the bond that came from facing the same challenge together, even after all these years. Thomas looked down at the medal still hanging around his neck. It wasn't made of gold or silver, and it didn't represent a first-place finish. But in many ways, it was more valuable than any trophy he had ever earned. It was a reminder that he still had something left to give, that age hadn't taken away his spirit, even if it had slowed his steps. He thought about what Jack had said earlier, about earning a good meal after a hell of a race. And it had been, not just a day's marathon, but the race of life itself. The ups and downs, the triumphs and the falls, it had all been worth it. He had earned this moment of peace, of reflection. But as the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Thomas realized that this wasn't the end. The marathon hadn't been his final race. It was simply the close of one chapter and the beginning of another. He would keep running, in whatever way he could, for as long as he could, not because he needed to prove anything, but because running had always been a part of him. It was how he connected to the world, how he found his place in it. And now, he knew that place didn't have to be at the front of the pack. It was wherever he was, doing what he loved at his own pace. Thomas stood up slowly, stretching his stiff legs, feeling the familiar twinge in his knees. He walked inside the house, leaving the cool night air behind. As he moved through the quiet rooms, his eyes fell on the old photo of him crossing the finish line at his first marathon, decades ago. He paused for a moment, looking at the young man in the picture, full of energy, full of life, so focused on the win. And then he glanced down at the medal around his neck, a quiet smile spreading across his face. It's not about the speed, he thought to himself. It's about the journey. And with that, Thomas felt ready for whatever came next, whether it was another race or simply another day. The important thing was that he would face it, just as he always had, with determination and heart. Because after all, the finish line wasn't the end. It was just a marker on a much longer road.